Why was Chevy so pissed?
He made some remarks that were deemed to be racist, a comment that he made, and I think that was kind of it.
Chevy Chase, the man who made millions laugh on screen. But behind the scenes, he made just as many enemies. From brutal fistfights to humiliating insults, some of Hollywood's biggest stars couldn't stand him. We're talking about legends who still hold grudges decades later. And the stories are so wild, you'll wonder how his career even survived. Today, we're exposing the top 10 actors who truly hated Chevy Chase the most. And before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see this comedy legend forever. By the late 1990s, filmmaker Kevin Smith was riding high with cult classics like Clerks and Chasing Amy. His sharp wit and love for pop culture made him the perfect candidate to revive a fan-favorite comedy, Fletch. Originally starring Chevy Chase, the franchise had a loyal following, and Smith envisioned breathing new life into it with a younger star like Jason Lee. On paper, it was a match made in comedy heaven. But that illusion didn't last long. When Smith sat down with Chevy to discuss the reboot, he expected an open-minded conversation about scripts, direction, and creative vision. Instead, what he got was something closer to a one-man ego show. According to Smith, Chevy spent most of the lunch bragging about his own brilliance, claiming not just credit for his roles, but for practically inventing comedy itself. At one point, Chase allegedly said he was responsible for every funny thing that ever happened in history. Not just in Hollywood, but in the entire universe. Smith described the experience as staring into a black hole of narcissism. The arrogance was so overwhelming, the project collapsed before it could even begin. Rather than collaborating, Chevy made it clear the only way forward was if the entire film revolved around him. Smith walked away stunned, vowing never to work with Chase again. When Smith later recounted the disaster in interviews, Chevy fired back, accusing him of lying and sabotaging the project. But to most who heard the story, it confirmed what Hollywood insiders had whispered for years. Chevy Chase was comedy royalty, but impossible to work with. But Chevy's clashes weren't limited to directors. Sometimes, his betrayal cut even deeper, with the very man who gave him his big break. In the mid-1970s, Saturday Night Live wasn't just a show. It was a revolution. And at the center of that revolution were two men, creator Lorne Michaels and breakout star Chevy Chase. The two were close allies, sharing a vision that reshaped American comedy and made Chase the first true superstar of SNL. For a brief moment, it looked like an unbreakable partnership. But in Hollywood, loyalty can disappear in an instant. At the height of his fame, Chase blindsided everyone by walking away from the show after just one season. While his contract had ended, it wasn't the exit itself that shocked people. It was how he handled it. No warning, no farewell to colleagues, no gesture of respect to the writers who helped make him a star. One day he was there, the next he was gone, already signing a lucrative deal for primetime specials with NBC. The fallout was brutal. His departure fractured not only his friendship with Michaels, but also his relationship with powerhouse manager Bernie Brillstein, who represented both men. Chase didn't just leave SNL, he jumped ship to a rival agency, signaling that money and fame came first, friendship second. Writers on the show felt betrayed. One even called him a scumbag years later, accusing him of being cold and calculated in the way he deserted his team. And when staff writer Tom Davis asked him why he left so soon, Chevy gave a blunt, unapologetic answer. It was all about the money. Lots of money. That single admission summed up the bitterness perfectly. What started as comedy's most promising duo ended in icy silence, leaving scars that never healed. And if you think walking away from SNL was bold, Chevy's next feud took aim at the king of late night himself. By the 1980s, Chevy Chase had already cemented his place as a comedy star. But while audiences laughed at his movies and sketches, Hollywood insiders knew him for something else: his arrogance. That ego put him on a collision course with none other than Johnny Carson, the undisputed king of late-night television. Rumors swirled that Chase might be considered as Carson's successor on The Tonight Show. For most comedians, that would have been the honor of a lifetime. But Chevy didn't see it that way. In an interview with New York Magazine, he dismissed the very idea with a smug jab, saying he could never imagine wasting years interviewing TV personalities. To him, hosting late night wasn't a dream job. It was beneath him. Those words cut deep because they didn't just insult the format. They insulted Carson's entire legacy. And Johnny, who almost never engaged in public spats, wasn't about to let it slide. In one razor-sharp line that spread through Hollywood like wildfire, Carson fired back. Chevy couldn't ad-lib a fart after a baked bean dinner. It was the ultimate burn. Carson, known for his surgical wit, had reduced Chevy's talent to nothing in a single punchline. For Chase, it was a humiliation that made it crystal clear he'd never be welcome in Carson's world. The clash highlighted something bigger. Chevy's rise had been fast, but his lack of humility made him enemies among comedy's most powerful gatekeepers. He wasn't just burning bridges, he was torching entire empires. And Carson wasn't the only one who saw through him. Years later, Chevy's arrogance would collide with a rising young star who had the world at his feet: Donald Glover. When Community debuted in 2009, fans were thrilled to see Chevy Chase back on TV, playing the oblivious, inappropriate millionaire Pierce Hawthorne. He seemed to be parodying himself, an aging comic relic clinging to relevance. But behind the scenes, the tension was anything but funny. For Donald Glover, who played Troy Barnes, the experience was deeply unsettling. Glover revealed that Chevy often made racially insensitive jokes between takes. Comments so pointed and cruel, they felt less like humor and more like attempts to cut him down. In one instance, Chase told him the only reason people laughed at his jokes was because he was black. It was shocking, but to those who knew Chevy, not surprising. Show creator Dan Harmon believed Chase's behavior came from pure jealousy. He saw Glover's quick rise, his youth, his versatility, and simply couldn't handle being outshined. Chase, once the face of American comedy, was now an older man watching the spotlight shift to someone younger, sharper, and more beloved. Glover himself later said Chase wasn't a villain, just a man in denial. To him, Chevy wasn't some evil mastermind, but a frightened relic terrified of irrelevance. But that didn't make the remarks any less toxic. They cast a shadow over Glover's time on the show, and for many fans, it permanently damaged their view of Chase. The tragic irony is clear. A man who once defined comedy for a generation couldn't celebrate the brilliance of the next one. Instead, he lashed out, making enemies of the very people who might have carried his legacy forward. And if Donald Glover saw him as a sad relic, another rival with a massive platform saw him as something much worse, an easy target. By the early 1990s, Chevy Chase had made a long list of enemies. But in 1992, he picked a fight with the one man in media you never want to cross: Howard Stern. With millions of loyal listeners and a reputation for tearing people apart, Stern thrived on feuds. And Chevy handed him the perfect ammunition. It started innocently enough with an appearance on Larry King Live. During commercial breaks, when he thought no one was listening, Chevy began mocking Stern, throwing out personal and dismissive remarks. The problem? Those breaks were recorded. And once Stern got his hands on the tapes, the war was on. Stern gleefully played the audio live on air, dissecting every insult and humiliating Chase in front of his massive audience. Then he took it a step further, calling Chevy directly. Chase snapped, reportedly telling him, "Don't ever call me again." But Stern wasn't finished. A few years later, he and fellow comedian Richard Belzer began prank calling Chase at 5 a.m., waking him up repeatedly just to get under his skin. Chevy was furious, lashing out at both men. But in a strange twist, the feud seemed to cool years later. Stern even invited Chase to his wedding in 2008 as a public olive branch. For a moment, it looked like the hatchet had been buried. But then came Chevy's toast. What should have been a warm, funny moment turned into a disaster. Guests described it as tone-deaf and offensive, filled with awkward jokes that left the room cringing. Any goodwill Stern had extended evaporated instantly. Once again, Chevy had taken a second chance and burned it to the ground. And if Stern could expose Chase with a microphone, his next enemy would humiliate him in a far more personal way, on the very set that was supposed to be his comeback. When Community premiered in 2009, it was a cult hit almost instantly. Fans loved its sharp writing, pop culture parodies, and bizarre but brilliant characters. And at first, seeing Chevy Chase as the clueless millionaire Pierce Hawthorne seemed like genius casting. After all, Pierce was pompous, oblivious, and out of touch, traits eerily similar to Chevy's real-life persona. But behind the curtain, things weren't funny. At the center of the storm was a bitter feud between Chevy Chase and the show's creator, Dan Harmon. Known for his perfectionism and fiery temper, Harmon wasn't easy to work with either. But when these two strong personalities clashed, the results were explosive. From the very beginning, Chevy bristled at the way Pierce was written. He complained that the jokes made him look like a bigot, and he hated being the butt of the humor. Harmon, however, leaned into it, even admitting that Pierce was partly inspired by Chevy himself. That only fueled the resentment. Things reached a boiling point during Season 3. After a heated dispute over a scene, Chevy left Harmon a voicemail filled with insults and expletives. But instead of keeping it private, Harmon played the voicemail at a party, in front of colleagues, friends, and even Chevy's own family. The public humiliation was devastating. Harmon later admitted he crossed the line and apologized. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Chevy grew increasingly distant from the cast and crew until he finally walked away during Season 4. The feud remains one of television's most notorious behind-the-scenes battles. And while it made Community more infamous, it also showed once again Chevy's unmatched ability to turn creative partnerships into personal vendettas. And sometimes, those vendettas got physical. Just ask comedian Rob Hubbell. For comedian Rob Hubbell, meeting Chevy Chase should have been a dream come true. Like so many comics of his generation, Hubbell grew up idolizing Chase's work on SNL, Caddyshack, and Fletch. So when the chance finally came to meet him backstage at the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater, Hubbell walked in excited, even a little starstruck. What happened next was the kind of moment you never forget, for all the wrong reasons. Without warning, Chevy slapped Hubbell across the face. Not a playful tap, not a lighthearted gag, but a hard, stinging slap that left the room silent. Everyone froze, unsure whether to laugh, intervene, or just stare in disbelief. Hubbell himself was stunned. Was this supposed to be a joke? A bizarre form of old-school comedy hazing? Or was Chase genuinely angry? Later, when asked about it, Chevy brushed it off, claiming it was just roughhousing, a bit of physical comedy he thought was funny. But nobody else saw it that way. To Hubbell, the slap wasn't funny. It was just weird. He didn't hold a grudge, saying later he didn't take offense. But the story became another infamous entry in Chevy's long list of uncomfortable encounters. What should have been a moment of admiration between a rising comedian and one of his heroes instead became a surreal humiliation. And for many, it perfectly summed up Chevy Chase's legacy. Unpredictable, abrasive, and crossing lines in ways that left people confused at best and offended at worst. And if you think slapping a fellow comedian was outrageous, His next feud took things to an even darker level, targeting one of SNL's first openly gay cast members. By 1985, Chevy Chase was already a household name, and when he returned to host Saturday Night Live, many expected a triumphant homecoming. Instead, his behavior during that week became one of the ugliest chapters in SNL history, especially for Terry Sweeney, the show's first openly gay cast member. Sweeney's presence on the show was groundbreaking. At a time when representation for LGBTQ performers was nearly non-existent, his role was seen as a step forward. But instead of celebrating that, Chevy decided to weaponize it. In a pitch meeting with writers, Chase suggested a recurring sketch so cruel it left the room stunned. His idea? A weekly segment weighing Sweeney to check whether he had contracted HIV. At a time when misinformation, fear, and stigma around AIDS were rampant, the suggestion wasn't just tasteless. It was deeply offensive and dehumanizing. For Sweeney, it wasn't a joke at all. It was bullying, wrapped in cruelty, exploiting a terrifying health crisis for cheap laughs. NBC executives were horrified. They ordered Chevy to apologize directly to Sweeney, but the apology was hardly sincere. According to Sweeney, Chase was furious, not because he regretted the comment, but because he hated being forced to admit he was wrong. He went through the motions, but the damage was already done. The incident cemented Chase's reputation as someone who didn't just push boundaries. He crossed them recklessly, with no regard for the harm it caused. For Terry Sweeney, the memory was a painful reminder that even comedy's biggest stages weren't safe from casual cruelty. And while this feud exposed Chevy's insensitivity, his next clash revealed something else entirely, a streak of personal cruelty that left even Robert Downey Jr. stunned. In 1985, Saturday Night Live was in chaos. Lorne Michaels had stepped away. The cast was young and inexperienced, and NBC was desperate to keep the show alive. When Chevy Chase was invited back to host that fall, some thought his return might inject much-needed star power. Instead, it turned into one of the most toxic weeks in SNL history. From the moment he walked in, Chevy carried himself with arrogance. Younger cast members who had idolized him quickly realized their hero wasn't there to inspire. He was there to belittle. And no one felt that sting more than a then up-and-coming Robert Downey Jr. During a writing session, Chase turned to Downey and, without any reason, asked about his father, filmmaker Robert Downey Sr. Then, with a smirk, he falsely claimed Downey's father had died, adding cruelly that he had probably gone to hell. The room fell silent. Even in a comedy environment where edgy jokes were common, this wasn't humor. It was personal, calculated, and needlessly cruel. Downey Jr. was visibly shaken and furious, though he kept his composure in the moment. But the insult hung heavy over the rest of the week, poisoning the already tense atmosphere. For many in the cast, the incident became proof of what they had suspected. Chevy wasn't just difficult. He could be outright vicious. What should have been a nostalgic return for one of SNL's founding stars instead exposed just how far his reputation for arrogance and cruelty had grown. And if humiliating Robert Downey Jr. wasn't enough, Chevy's next feud turned into a physical brawl with another comedy legend, Bill Murray. By 1978, Saturday Night Live had already made Chevy Chase a household name. But when he returned to host after leaving the show the year before, the atmosphere backstage was anything but welcoming. In fact, it exploded into one of the most infamous fights in comedy history. Bill Murray had been brought in to fill the void Chevy left behind, and from day one, the two never got along. Their rivalry simmered for months, but Chase's return lit the fuse. Hours before showtime, the tension boiled over. Murray confronted him directly, saying what everyone else on the cast felt but didn't dare say out loud. "Everyone here hates you." Chevy fired back, mocking Murray's acne-scarred skin by comparing it to the surface of the moon. a line so cruel it stung immediately. Murray didn't hold back either. In a cutting blow, he made a jab about Chevy's marriage, pushing the argument into personal territory. The insults turned physical fast. In John Belushi's dressing room, Chase and Murray squared off, throwing punches while Belushi scrambled to break it up, only to catch a few blows himself. Chaos erupted until others intervened and pulled them apart. And then, minutes later, Chase walked out onto the stage with a smile, delivering his opening monologue as if nothing had happened. The audience had no clue that just behind the curtain, fists had been flying. The fight became legend, not just because it was shocking, but because it perfectly captured who Chevy Chase had become. A star who could turn friends into enemies and comedy into combat. But even with so many fights, insults, and betrayals, one question still lingers. What does all this mean for Chevy Chase's legacy? Chevy Chase's career is one of Hollywood's great contradictions. On screen, he was the charming everyman, the quick-witted prankster, the face of some of the most beloved comedies of all time. But off-screen, the stories tell a different tale, one of arrogance, cruelty, and burned bridges. From Kevin Smith walking away from a dream project to Donald Glover enduring racially charged remarks, to Bill Murray throwing punches backstage, the list of actors who clashed with Chevy isn't just long, it's legendary. And these weren't minor disagreements. They were bitter feuds, cruel insults, and humiliating public moments that defined his reputation as much as his comedy ever did. In many ways, Chevy's downfall is a cautionary tale. Talent can make you a star, but ego can just as quickly make you an outcast. Today, his name sparks more stories of conflict than triumph, and his once glittering career stands as a reminder of how fast admiration can turn to resentment. But maybe the most fascinating part of Chevy Chase's legacy is that he was always authentic, for better or worse. The man you saw on screen wasn't an act, it was him. And that authenticity, raw and unfiltered, earned him both laughter and lifelong enemies. So what do you think? Was Chevy Chase simply misunderstood, or was he his own worst enemy? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Hollywood's untold rivalries, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Because in show business, the drama behind the curtain is often wilder than anything you'll ever see on stage.